listener production.
Hey, I'm Bension Siebert. Welcome to The Briefing. Just a note, we'll be discussing mental health and suicide in this episode. Help is out there. We'll put places you can find it in the show notes and at the end of this episode. After receiving thousands of submissions and holding hearings across the country over 3 years, the Royal Commission into Veteran Suicide is releasing its final report today. It's expected to outline shameful failures within Australia's Defence Forces to support veterans' mental and physical health, especially as they transition into civilian life after serving. Tasmanian Senator Jacqui Lambie knows this firsthand. She first called for this Royal Commission as she entered Parliament more than a decade ago. She's a military veteran herself and someone who's been open publicly about her struggle with physical and mental health after she served. She's one of this country's most powerful advocates for veterans and their families, and she's concerned failures in the ADF are not only destroying lives, but undermining our national security. Jacqui Lambie, welcome to The Briefing.
Thank you very much for having me on.
The Commission received literally thousands of submissions from veterans and their families. Can you tell us about one of the stories that moved you during this process?
I think for me, I've had hundreds, if not thousands of stories come through me. We've had to fight very hard for these people, even without a Royal Commission. I've seen some of the most horrendous stories that you will ever see. I've seen the 33 disgusting folders of defence abuse that were never shown and never asked for by the top brass of our military. That's how much they wanted to clean up the military. They never requested or told the government of the day that they would see those 33 folders and see whose names had been accused of abuse. And I mean, it's the worst sort of abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, psychological abuse. They didn't want to know those names. So I knew looking at that 7 or 8 years ago, some of those people were still serving and making their way up through the ranks. Well, the people they had abused, whether that's psychologically, physically or sexually, were still serving in the military. This is what happens when you're part of an institution. So it is the institution before anybody else, and this is the mindset they've got to get themselves out of the military. It's not about the military, it's about looking after your people so you have a decent military. They seem to have lost that.
Is part of the problem, speaking as a veteran yourself, in the culture of defence connected to a broader problem about masculinity in the sense of men in particular being at higher risk of suicide?
I think with the military, you've got to remember the military, especially the Army, last I checked, I think there's about 15 or 16% that are female and the rest are male. It is a very big male-dominated area, there is no doubt. But I think that masculinity that you're talking about, it really hits home once again when you've been fighting a department for a couple of years, you haven't been paid and you can no longer have any money in your bank to fend for your family or to provide the services that your family needs, whether it's food, petrol, just your normal, even a gym set of, running shoes for your own children to play sport in. That's when it really starts to dig in. It starts to dig in hard. And yes, I think it is harder for those men to understand that because men, it's when they're brought up to be the provider, the food winner, someone that has to provide all the time for the family. And I think that's very much still the Australian culture and that is still the expectation. So when they can't provide that, that's a double hit for them, mate, yeah.
Top line, what needs to change in defence?
I want the Australian Defence Force Academy closed. I'm sick of seeing little rich kids come out and tell poor kids what they're going to do. And they think that because those kids have come from rich homes, that they are better leaders. Well, these kids have been given everything on a silver platter. Their mums and dads know everybody at the top here, so even if they don't have the grades, they can get the jobs that they want. This is what's going on in society, and this is what's happened with our Defence Force. There is no need for the billions of dollars that we've spent on the Australian Defence Force Academy to bring you through at 18 years of age, pay for your schooling and say you're a leader is absolutely rubbish. Everybody has to go through that first initial training together. And over the next 2 to 5 years, we will determine, or the people in uniform will determine when leadership starts to show. Because some people take a couple of years before they get comfortable. I'm a big believer is you don't gain leadership, you're either born with it or you're not. And I think they're missing this, which is a real problem. And they need to know how to look after their diggers. And like I've said, mate, it doesn't matter whether you're injured or not. If you are still able to do something in a wheelchair, if you're still able to do something with an arm and you've only got one of them, if you've got PTSD, then work along with them. because other employment people that they go to work with, they do it. What they're saying now is easier to get into the military. You don't have to be medically fit, but they're actually not looking after their own and showing a way forward with the people that they've got inside in uniform. So how do they expect that those people outside, how are you going to entice them to join up if they're not physically or psychologically what we used to call medical class 1? You can put them on the front line. Not everybody has to be on the front line, mate. We need people in logistics. You know, we can have instructors that are running around transport yards in a wheelchair. They are not looking after their own and giving them further opportunities if they're hurt. And that's a real problem, and they've got to move on this.
Speaking of recruitment, Defence is now recruiting from a pool of people made up of Gen Z and millennials. This is a demographic and a population that's more literate than others have been on issues of mental health. Do you think that this is a problem for recruitment going forward?
Yeah, it is a massive risk. There is a massive risk, and there is a campaign going on now, don't join until it's fixed. And quite frankly, unless they fix it in the next 3 to 6 months, I'll be right on top of that campaign. They won't have anyone joining at all, okay? I will call them out. And unless you're going to start looking after, whether I don't care what generation's in there, but they need to start looking after them. If they're not going to, I'm going to call them out every day that I possibly can for not doing that job. And that's going to be very hurtful, especially to our national security.
Well, could you talk about that national security risk?
Yeah, so the national security risk is simple. If we've got people getting out and we haven't got people joining, then we don't have boots on the ground. Right now, many years ago, it used to be about 10 or 12% that was officer. Now we have nearly a quarter of our military that is being paid on an officer salary, and we have about 3,000 combat troops out of about 80 or 85,000 full-time members that are out there across all, across Navy, Air Force and Army. So that's a real problem when you only look at 3,000 that can be on the front line that are fully fit, ready to fight. You know, that is a massive issue. It means we've got no boots on the ground. So you better pray to God, if anything happens, that we have the technology, which we do not, and we are miles behind on defence spend in this country, that we have the technology, whether it's missiles up top or whatever, because we're not sure as hell not going to have the boots on the ground. That's where we're at.
There's now been nearly 60 inquiries into defence and veteran suicide over the past 30 years, as I'm sure you know. Is there any sign that this report won't just sit on the shelf?
Well, I'm up for re-election, mate, in about 6 or 7 months' time. So I'm hoping that the people of Tasmania give me another 6 years. But certainly it's very difficult to do anything on the outside. I will admit that. And that's why service organisations are not getting much of a go up here. So for me, if I'm left up here, I'll be continuing the fight for those veterans from the time I started to the time I finished up here. That's pretty simple for me. But I'll tell you, I will be fighting tooth and nail to get those recommendations in. I think that there's so much public awareness. What they don't need is more heat on it out there. And I have no problem in spending Jacqui Lambie network money and running ads in the papers. If that's going to be my choice instead of using it on an election, I will do that, just to remind every Australian out there that they're still not looking after them.
Will you push the government on it?
I'll be pushing the government all the way. I'm just throbbing at the mouth to get those recommendations in, mate. I'm starting to feel a bit disheartened. Yeah, no, I'll be standing, against the government the whole way.
Jacqui Lambie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Tasmanian Senator Jacqui Lambie there. If this conversation has raised anything for you, you can seek help. Open Arms provides 24-hour free and confidential counselling and support for current and former ADF members and their families. You can call 1-800-011-046. That's 1-800-011-046. And you can call Lifeline on 131114. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow from 6 a.m. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.